They called them the Tiny Twins of New York, identical sisters born in 1873, their bodies small, their lives marked not by kindness, but by exploitation. Displayed as curiosities, mourned as spectacles, and buried as shadows, their story is one of love, cruelty, and a world that refused to understand them. Tonight, on the Macabre record, we uncover their forgotten legend. Two sisters bound by an unbreakable bond, broken by the gaze of a society that saw them as wonders, not as human beings. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the Macabre record and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. New York in 1873 was a city caught between progress and poverty. The streets echoed with the clang of ironworks and the cries of street vendors. Gas lamps flickered over cobblestones slick with mud, while the smell of smoke from factories lingered in the air. Immigration swelled the city's population, and tenement buildings rose like crooked towers, cramming entire families into single dark rooms. It was here, in the shadows of industry and hardship, that the tiny twins first drew breath. Their parents, recent arrivals seeking a better life, found instead a struggle for survival. Every coin mattered. Every day was a fight against hunger, sickness, and despair. Into this unforgiving world, the sisters were born, fragile yet alive, a miracle to their mother and father, but a curiosity to nearly everyone else. The Victorian era carried with it a peculiar blend of fascination and fear toward those who looked different. Science was advancing, yet superstition still clung stubbornly to the minds of many. Dwarfism, poorly understood and rarely studied, was often wrapped in myths. Some believed it to be a divine punishment, others whispered it carried curses or dark omens. And when two identical sisters appeared, smaller than other children, identical like mirror images, those whispers grew louder. To the struggling families around them, their presence was both a marvel and a source of unease. Stories spread quickly in crowded neighborhoods, and soon the girls' names became known beyond their block. Strangers would come not to offer kindness, but to glimpse them as if they were sights to be marveled at. In a city overflowing with desperate faces, the twins stood out, not for what they could do, but for what they could never change. Yet behind the gossip and the stares, their family did what they could to shelter them. The girls were dressed in matching hand-sewn dresses, their hair combed and tied with scraps of ribbon, their lives guarded as best as possible from the cold eyes of the world. But even then, a sense of inevitability hung over them. In a city where survival itself was a performance, the girls' difference would soon draw more than passing attention. In the shadows of New York's booming entertainment scene, men were already watching, calculating, and waiting for the right time to turn the tiny twins into a show. The early years of the sisters' lives were marked by a strange duality. On one side, the warmth of a family that tried to protect them, and on the other, the constant whispers that followed wherever they went. In the crowded hallways of their tenement, neighbors muttered that such births were unnatural, that two children so small must surely be a sign. Some claimed the family was cursed, others said the sisters would not live past infancy, that they were too fragile to survive the harsh winters of New York. Yet the girls grew, slowly but surely, their bodies smaller than others their age, but their spirits unbroken. Each step they took became proof against the grim predictions made at their birth. Children in the neighborhood, often cruel in their honesty, sometimes jeered at them, calling them names or imitating their stature. But curiosity ran deeper than cruelty. Many gathered at doorways just to glimpse the twins as they played in the street, their movements synchronized in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. Identical in every detail, they were like reflections come to life, and their bond was evident even then. They rarely left each other's side. If one reached for a toy, the other would mimic her hand. If one laughed, the other joined almost instantly, as though their joy was tethered by an invisible thread. But their difference set them apart. In a city filled with families from all over the world, where accents clashed and cultures collided, the twins' appearance became something more than unusual. It became a subject of fascination. Some believed they were omens of prosperity, others that they carried misfortune. One story told among neighbors claimed that if you saw the sisters at dawn, it foretold the death of a relative. Another rumor suggested they could feel each other's pain, a tale that would follow them into adulthood and become one of the myths woven into their legend. Inside their home, their parents tried to preserve normalcy. They ate meals together at a rough-hewn table, their mother teaching them prayers in the dim light of a kerosene lamp. But even there, the walls seemed too thin to keep out the world. The stares, the murmurs, the curiosity, they seeped in like drafts through broken windows. The twins were children, but they were already learning what it meant to live as both marvel and mystery, cherished in one moment, ridiculed in the next. And outside their door, the city's appetite for spectacle was growing stronger by the day. As the sisters grew, their closeness became something that even hardened neighbors could not ignore. They were not just inseparable, they seemed to live as if joined by thought. They spoke constantly, but not in a way that others could understand. From an early age, they had developed their own language, a secret code of sounds and rhythms that baffled even their parents. To outsiders, it was gibberish, but between the two of them, it carried meaning as clear as daylight. A nod, a glance, a word only they recognized, and the other would respond as though the thought had been shared before it was spoken. This private world gave them a refuge. In the crowded, judgmental streets of New York, they had each other, a bond that no ridicule could penetrate. When one sister stumbled, the other would instinctively reach out her hand. When one cried, the other's tears were not far behind. It was as though they were mirrors of each other's soul, reflecting joys and sorrows with perfect fidelity. To those who watched from a distance, the effect was uncanny. Some said the girls were bewitched, others claimed they shared a single spirit divided between two bodies. The whispers grew into stories, and the stories grew into superstition. Yet for the sisters, their language was not magic. It was survival. It gave them privacy when the world treated them as public property. It gave them comfort when jeers and cruel laughter stung their ears. And it gave them power, for in a life where they had little control, this language was theirs alone. When showmen first heard of it, they saw not the beauty of the bond, but another trick to be marketed, another oddity to sell to audiences eager for strangeness. Even within their family, their bond created unease. Their parents, though loving, sometimes wondered if the girls' closeness made them blind to the world beyond each other. Neighbors claimed that if one sister fell ill, the other would cough the same cough, shiver the same shiver. Whether true or imagined, the belief only deepened the legend surrounding them. To some, they were living proof of mystery in a city rushing toward modernity. To others, they were unnatural, something to be studied or shunned. And as their language grew richer, as their bond grew stronger, the inevitability of their fate also grew clearer. The world beyond their secret words was watching, and soon the city would no longer be content to glimpse them from doorways. The stage was waiting. In the Victorian world, difference was a double-edged blade. On one side, society claimed to value science and progress. On the other, it clung to superstition and prejudice. Those born with unusual appearances were rarely seen as human first. Instead, they became objects of fascination, tokens of curiosity, or evidence for some imagined moral lesson. Among these differences, dwarfism was one of the most exploited. Though medical journals of the time occasionally mentioned the condition, true study was almost non-existent. Doctors observed but did not seek to understand. Instead of compassion, there was classification. Instead of treatment, there was spectacle. The wealthy and powerful sometimes kept dwarfs in their households, a practice that echoed medieval courts where individuals of short stature had been kept as entertainers or companions. By the 19th century, this practice had evolved into something even crueler: public exhibition. As cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia grew, so did the hunger for amusement. Theaters and dime museums promised wonders from around the world: exotic animals, strange inventions, and, most tragically, living people displayed for their physical differences. To the audiences, it was entertainment. To those on stage, it was a prison with velvet curtains. For twin sisters born with dwarfism, this culture meant that their lives were mapped out before they even had a chance to decide who they were. It was not a question of if they would be exhibited, but when. The Victorian mind saw their existence not as a story of two children growing in a harsh city, but as a natural curiosity to be packaged and sold. And because they were twins, identical, inseparable, and striking in their similarity, the fascination was doubled. Where one might have been pitied, two became a performance, an act waiting to be exploited. The language of the era reveals much about how they were viewed. Words like oddity, wonder, freak, and specimen were tossed about freely, printed in newspapers and advertisements without shame. The twins were not alone in this. Others with dwarfism, giants, people with unusual skin conditions, and those born with missing limbs all found themselves drawn into the same cruel orbit. The public appetite was insatiable. They paid to gape, to whisper, to point, and each coin that dropped into a showman's pocket made it easier to forget that the lives being displayed were as human as their own. For the sisters, the world outside their home grew colder with each passing year. The whispers of neighbors, the curiosity of strangers, the myths of shared souls, all of it was leading to a single destination. The stage lights were waiting, and the Victorian world would soon demand its spectacle. It was inevitable that word of the twins would spread beyond the narrow blocks of their neighborhood. In a city where gossip traveled faster than the streetcars, stories of two identical sisters, small as children, yet growing older with each year, soon reached ears trained to recognize profit. Showmen were always on the hunt for the unusual. They roamed the streets, haunted the taverns, and listened for whispers of anything that could be turned into a spectacle. The city's dime museums and traveling circuses thrived on such discoveries, and the promise of twin sisters with dwarfism was too tempting to ignore. The first visit came under the guise of kindness. A man in a dark coat knocked at the family's door, introducing himself as a patron of the arts, a man who could offer opportunity. He spoke of stages and applause, of money that could ease the family's poverty, of a future brighter than the narrow halls of the tenement. For parents worn down by endless labor and the threat of hunger, the promise was almost seductive. The twins, he said, would be celebrated, admired, even loved by audiences who would pay to see them. But behind the polished words lay the truth. The sisters would not be seen as children or as human beings. They would be seen as curiosities, dressed up and paraded for the amusement of strangers. Resistance was difficult. In that era, poor families had little power against the persuasion of money and the pressure of society. Neighbors encouraged it, suggesting that perhaps the stage was the only place where such children truly belonged. Some even claimed it was destiny, that God had made them different so they could entertain, so that others could learn some lesson from their appearance. The twins themselves were too young to understand what was being decided. They listened to promises of adventure, of travel, of excitement beyond the grey streets they knew. But the eyes of the man in the dark coat lingered too long, his smile too thin. He did not see children before him. He saw an act. Before long, contracts were signed, ink on paper that reduced 2 lives to performance schedules. Their parents, whether out of desperation or resignation, agreed. And with that, the sisters' private world began to collapse. Their secret language, once a shield, would soon be turned into a trick for the stage. Their matching ribbons and dresses, once tokens of family love, would become costumes. The curtain was rising, and the sisters were no longer free. The night of their first performance was one of both wonder and dread. The sisters, dressed in identical lace dresses stitched hastily by costumers, were brought onto the stage of a crowded dime museum in Lower Manhattan. Gas lamps bathed them in a harsh glow, illuminating every detail of their small frames and identical features. The crowd stirred the moment they appeared. There was a gasp, followed by the hum of voices whispering in disbelief. Some clapped, others laughed, and a few simply stared in silence, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they thought they knew of the world. To the sisters, the noise was overwhelming. They clutched each other's hands tightly, their eyes darting from the blinding lights to the endless sea of faces. The showman who had brought them there announced them as the Miniature Maidens of Manhattan. His voice boomed with theatrical exaggeration, promising the audience that these sisters were living wonders, proof of nature's strangest curiosities. He spoke of their identical bond, of their secret language, even claiming that the twins could feel each other's thoughts. Each detail fed the imagination of the spectators, who hungered not for truth, but for spectacle. The sisters were instructed to recite verses and sing a simple song. Their voices, high and childlike, trembled at first, but then found strength in their unison. The audience erupted in applause, not for the quality of the performance, but for the oddity of the sight. Here were two grown children, identical, fragile, moving and speaking as if one. The applause felt like thunder, but beneath it was the sting of something cruel, the knowledge that they were being admired not for who they were, but for how they appeared. Behind the curtain, the showman congratulated them, his words sweetened with promises of more applause, more admiration, more money. But the sisters could feel the difference. This was not admiration, it was ownership. Their private bond, their secret world, had been laid bare for strangers who would never understand them. They held each other close, whispering in their private language, clinging to the only thing that remained theirs. Yet the audience demanded more. Each performance drew larger crowds, each night feeding the appetite of a city eager to be astonished. Posters with their faces plastered walls and taverns. Coins clinked into the showman's pockets. And the sisters, whether they realized it or not, were no longer children of New York. They were a commodity, bound to a stage that would never willingly let them go. When the curtains closed and the applause faded, the sisters' world was far different from the glittering stage. Behind the velvet drapes and wooden panels, they sat quietly, their hands entwined, whispering in the strange rhythm of their private language. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and stale perfume, and the floorboards beneath their feet were sticky from spilled drinks. The stage hands and other performers passed by without much notice, used to the sight of the unusual, the exotic, the grotesque. But to the sisters, this backstage life felt like a cage, one where their every movement was monitored, their every gesture rehearsed and corrected. The showman had made promises of admiration and opportunity, but in truth, the girls were given little choice. Their days quickly became cycles of preparation and performance. They were dressed in costumes, their hair curled and pinned, their cheeks powdered with rouge to make them appear more doll-like. Even their private bond, their secret language, was turned into a trick. They were told to exchange words before the audience, instructed to look as though they were sharing thoughts through invisible threads. The crowd laughed, gasped, and clapped, never realizing they were intruding on something deeply personal. What had once been their safe world was now a commodity, stripped of its innocence and sold as entertainment. The sisters endured it together, but the weight pressed down heavily on them. They whispered to each other that the applause felt hollow, that the laughter stung more than it soothed. They were not celebrated, they were consumed. And though the coins collected each night promised food and rent for their family, the sisters themselves rarely saw any of it. They were tools in the hands of men who viewed them as little more than curiosities. Yet, amid the cruelty, there were fleeting moments of tenderness. When the curtains closed and the world forgot them for a few hours, they would retreat to their small quarters, huddling together beneath a single thin blanket. They whispered dreams of escape, of a world where they could walk the streets without stairs, where they could learn, read, and grow like other children. But as the days turned into months, those dreams grew dimmer. The show went on, and with each night the sisters realized that their lives were no longer theirs to dream about. They belonged to the stage, and the stage would not let them go. The world of sideshows in the late 19th century was a paradox, wrapped in velvet curtains and gilded posters, yet built entirely on cruelty. New York alone had dozens of dime museums, halls of amusement, and traveling exhibitions that promised wonders never before seen by human eyes. Crowds poured in for a penny or two, eager to leave behind their own grinding lives for an hour of astonishment. They came not to be educated, but to be entertained, and what they demanded was strangeness. For this appetite, people like the twin sisters became a lucrative supply. The sisters were not alone. They shared the stage with others whose lives had been reduced to spectacle. The giant who towered over 7 feet, his back bent with pain. The bearded woman whose condition had been turned into a joke. The man with tattoos from head to toe, branded as savage by posters. And the so-called living skeleton, a starving figure whose frailty drew gasps of both horror and delight. Each had a story, a family, a name, but in the glare of stage lights, these were stripped away. They were reduced to labels, to curiosities, to creatures of myth. The cruelty was masked in the language of wonder. Posters described marvels, curiosities of nature, and astonishing phenomena. But beneath those words lay human suffering, packaged neatly for public consumption. Audiences clapped and pointed, their fascination tinged with fear. They wanted to believe they were glimpsing something beyond nature, something that confirmed their suspicions about curses, omens, or divine punishment. In truth, they were staring at ordinary people caught in extraordinary misfortune, people who had been given no choice but to become part of the show. For the sisters, the sideshow was both a stage and a prison. Each night they performed, each night they endured the laughter and whispers, each night they returned backstage to whispers of escape that grew quieter with time. They had become a fixture, a permanent act in a cruel rotation of human exhibition. The very differences that had once drawn stares from neighbors now drew coins from strangers, and in a world that thrived on novelty, they could not leave. If they disappeared, the showmen would find them, and if they resisted, the show would simply move on without them, leaving their family deeper in poverty. Thus, the sideshow consumed them, body, spirit, and identity. And for the audience, the curtain always rose again. As the sisters' fame grew, so too did the myths that clung to them like shadows. The Victorian world was obsessed with explanations, but when science refused to study what it did not understand, superstition eagerly filled the void. The sisters, identical in every detail and inseparable in every movement, became fertile ground for rumor. Spectators left the dime museums whispering not just about their small stature, but about what it must mean. Some insisted they were cursed, a punishment delivered to their family for unknown sins. Others claimed they were blessed, touched by the divine, carrying secrets from heaven or from darker realms. One tale suggested that the sisters shared a single soul. If one was cut, the other would bleed. If one was struck, the other would bruise. This idea of shared pain, though unproven, spread quickly among audiences who wanted to believe they were witnessing something supernatural. The showmen encouraged it, of course, for myths were as profitable as facts. They whispered to reporters that experiments had been performed, that the girls had demonstrated uncanny connections no one could explain. The truth mattered less than the story, and in the world of spectacle the story was everything. There were darker rumors too. In some neighborhoods, whispers carried through alleys that to glimpse the sisters at dawn was to invite death into one's family. Others claimed that they could speak to spirits through their private language, that the strange rhythm of their words was a kind of incantation. The girls themselves, of course, knew these things to be nonsense, but they were powerless to stop the stories. Each tale added another layer to the mask the world forced them to wear, until their true selves were buried beneath fabrications of wonder and fear. For the audiences, these myths transformed the twins from children into something otherworldly. They were not daughters of immigrants living in poverty. They were the miniature maidens, beings who defied explanation. And the more the myths grew, the less human they became in the eyes of those who watched them. To be seen as supernatural was to be seen as unreal. It stripped away their humanity as surely as the applause stripped away their dignity. And yet, despite the cruelty of it, the myths ensured that the sisters could never escape. Their legend was growing beyond their control, and soon it would bind them tighter than any contract ever could. The sisters did not remain confined to New York for long. Fame in the Victorian world was portable, and showmen wasted no time in carrying their living curiosities from city to city. Within a year of their first performance, the tiny twins were touring across the northeastern states, appearing in Boston, Philadelphia, and eventually as far west as Chicago. Everywhere they went, posters preceded them, plastered on brick walls and wooden fences, proclaiming the arrival of the Miniature Maidens of Manhattan. Crowds gathered not just out of curiosity, but out of hunger for something to whisper about afterward, a tale to tell neighbors and co-workers about the night they saw the little sisters who spoke in secret tongues and mirrored each other's every move. The travel itself was grueling. Carriages rattled over rough roads, trains carried them in stuffy compartments where coal smoke choked the air, and boarding houses offered little comfort. The sisters endured nights in cramped beds, days without proper meals, and the endless intrusion of strangers who demanded a glimpse even when no show was scheduled. They were never left alone. Even their private moments were invaded, as managers insisted they remain in costume or at least dressed alike in public so as never to break the illusion. Their very existence had been turned into a performance, 24 hours a day. Yet, in each new city, the legend grew larger. Newspapers printed exaggerated accounts of their shows, calling them wonders of nature, curiosities beyond explanation. Some papers claimed they had been examined by doctors who could find no difference in their heartbeats, as though the twins shared one body. Others reported that spiritualists had attempted to commune with them, believing their private language to be some lost tongue of angels or demons. The sisters themselves were rarely quoted. Their voices did not matter. Only the myth mattered, and the myth was what sold tickets. The money flowed steadily into the pockets of the men who managed them, but little of it reached the girls or their family. Promises of financial stability, of comfort, of dignity had evaporated into the smoke of the stage lights. The twins were carried further from home, further from childhood, and deeper into a world where the line between human and spectacle was erased. Their faces smiled from posters across America, but behind those smiles was exhaustion. They were young, still children in many ways, yet they had already lived lives bent beneath the weight of an audience that never stopped staring. The grind of travel and performance soon began to wear down the sisters' fragile bodies. Dwarfism carried with it challenges that the Victorian world did not care to understand, and the endless routines of the sideshow only magnified their struggles. Each day brought new demands: early morning preparations, long journeys by rattling trains or horse-drawn wagons, followed by hours of performance under hot lamps and watchful eyes. Meals were irregular, often no more than stale bread or watery broth in boarding houses where the cheapest lodgings were always chosen. Sleep was broken by noise, cold draughts, and the ceaseless ache of fatigue that crept into their bones. The sisters tried to endure it together. They held hands as the trains thundered into the night, whispering in their secret language to comfort one another when the world outside felt too harsh. But even their bond could not protect them from the toll the years were taking. Their backs grew stiff, their joints ached, and their lungs strained in the smoke-filled theatres where they were forced to sing and recite before restless crowds. They were pushed to perform again and again, sometimes twice a day, with little thought for their health. The showman, after all, saw only ticket sales, not the cost in pain or exhaustion. Audiences, too, were relentless. The novelty that first shocked them wore off quickly, and so the managers demanded more. New costumes, new routines, exaggerated stories to keep the crowds returning. The sisters were instructed to dance, to mimic each other's gestures, to repeat their strange private language on command as if it were a trick rather than their bond. The more they gave, the more was demanded, until the performances became not acts of choice, but acts of survival. And still, the applause rang hollow, filled with laughter that did not sound like admiration, but like mockery dressed in cheer. As the months turned into years, the decline became visible. One sister coughed often, her small frame shivering with chills even under heavy blankets. The other grew thinner, her face pale beneath the layers of stage paint. Their once bright eyes, mirrors of each other's spirit, seemed dulled by weariness. Whispers began among those backstage that the girls could not last long under such strain. But no one spoke of stopping, for the show had no room for weakness. As long as they could stand beneath the lamps, the curtain would rise, and the audience would clap, never seeing the cost of the spectacle they consumed. It was during one bitter winter on the road that the first signs of real danger appeared. The sisters had just finished a grueling string of performances in Philadelphia when one of them collapsed backstage, coughing so violently that blood stained her handkerchief. At first, the showmen dismissed it as fatigue, urging her to rest for a day before returning to the stage. But the cough did not fade. It deepened, rattling her small chest, leaving her gasping for air after only a few minutes of exertion. The crude medicine of the day offered little relief. Doctors were rarely called, and when they were, they gave vague assurances or muttered about weak constitutions, offering tonics that did nothing to slow the decline. Her sister remained constantly at her side, refusing to let her out of sight even for a moment. When one coughed, the other would shudder, as though her body, too, shared the pain. It fed into the rumors that had long circulated, that the twins shared not just a bond, but a single life force. To those who watched them, it was proof of something supernatural. To the sisters, it was something far simpler, love so strong that one could not bear to watch the other suffer. Still, the performances continued. The showmen insisted that a lighter routine would suffice, that the audiences did not care whether the sisters sang or danced, so long as they appeared together on stage. Even as her cough worsened, the sickly twin was dressed, powdered, and pushed before the crowd. Each night, she forced a smile as gas lamps burned hot against her pale face, each round of applause costing her more strength than she could afford to give. Backstage, the surviving sister clutched her hand, whispering in their secret language, urging her to hold on. She promised they would escape someday, that they would walk freely in the streets without stares, that they would be more than the playthings of strangers. But deep down, she must have known the promise was already slipping beyond reach. The illness was too strong, the body too frail, and as the weeks dragged on, it became clear to everyone, audience, manager, and family alike, that the tiny twin story was approaching its end. The end came quietly, without the drama of the stage or the glare of the lamps. One cold night, after another day of struggling to breathe, the weaker sister slipped into stillness, her frail body finally surrendering to the illness that had haunted her for months. She died in her bed, her sister's hand clasped tightly in her own, their secret language murmured until the very last breath. For the surviving twin, it was as if the world itself had cracked apart, the voice that had echoed her own since birth, the reflection that had met her gaze in every mirror, was suddenly gone. Where once there had been a perfect symmetry, now there was only silence and absence. News of the death spread quickly. The managers were swift to act, ensuring that the story appeared in local newspapers, but the headlines did not speak of tragedy or the pain of a family losing a daughter. Instead, they framed it as the end of a spectacle. "The Miniature Maidens no more," one paper declared, reducing the death to a footnote in the theatre listings. Some articles dwelled on the myths, speculating whether the surviving sister would live long without her twin, as if her grief was a curiosity to be studied rather than a wound to be respected. Others spoke of the dead girl as if she had been nothing more than a prop, praising her final performances without acknowledging the suffering behind them. The audiences who had once gasped and clapped now treated the death as gossip. Patrons in taverns whispered about whether the sisters truly shared one soul, wondering aloud if the surviving girl would soon follow. Some even claimed the managers should have put her back on stage immediately to see if she could continue the act alone. Compassion was scarce. Curiosity was endless. For the surviving twin, grief consumed every moment. She refused food, refused comfort, spending her hours clutching the ribbon her sister had worn in her hair, rocking silently in her chair. She no longer spoke to her family or to her keepers, reserving her voice only for the one who was gone. She whispered into the air in their private language, as though waiting for an answer that would never come. Her world had been built around her twin, and with that foundation gone, nothing remained. In the days following her sister's death, the surviving twin became a shadow of herself. Where once her voice had been steady, joined in unison with the only companion she had ever known, now it faltered into silence. She spoke to no one but the empty air, her lips moving in the strange cadence of their private language, as though she believed her sister might still be listening. To her parents, this was heartbreaking, but to the showmen who had controlled her life, it was simply inconvenient. They had built an act on symmetry, on the fascination of two identical girls mirroring one another. With half of that mirror gone, the illusion was broken. The surviving twin was no longer a spectacle, but a reminder of loss, and loss did not sell tickets. She retreated from the world, refusing to eat, refusing to dress in the costumes that once defined her stage identity. Her health, already fragile, declined rapidly under the weight of her grief. Some claimed she seemed to wither by choice, as though she had decided that a life without her sister was no life at all. To neighbors and stagehands, her silence became its own legend. They whispered that she could see her twin in dreams, that she wandered the halls at night, calling softly in their private tongue, searching for an answer that never came. The newspapers fueled the fascination. Reporters speculated openly that her death was inevitable, that the bond between the sisters was so absolute that one could not survive the other. Spiritualists seized the story as proof of their beliefs, arguing that the twins had been connected by forces beyond science. They wrote of soul bonds and ethereal threads, crafting stories that blurred grief with the supernatural. The surviving sister, who needed compassion, was instead turned into a symbol, her suffering twisted into another form of spectacle for the Victorian imagination. Her decline was rapid. She stopped appearing in public altogether, and those who caught glimpses of her described a hollow figure, pale and frail, her eyes fixed on some point far beyond the present. She no longer seemed to belong to the living. Each day without her twin pulled her further away, and those around her waited with a grim sense of inevitability. The stage had lost one of its stars, and the world watched with morbid anticipation for the other to follow. The end came as quietly as it had for her sister, though to those who witnessed it there was a sense of inevitability, as if grief itself had claimed her. Weeks after her twin's passing, the surviving girl refused nearly all food and drink, her small body shrinking further, her strength dwindling to nothing. She rarely spoke in English anymore, choosing instead to murmur in the strange private tongue they had shared, as though every word was a rope cast into the darkness, hoping her sister might grasp it from the other side. At night, her parents sometimes found her curled up in her sister's empty bed, clutching the ribbon that had once tied back her twin's hair, whispering until sleep overcame her. No doctor could explain her decline. There were mutterings of consumption, of a weak constitution, of nerves. But those closest to her knew the truth. Her spirit was broken. To live without her sister was unthinkable. They had been born together, grown together, lived as reflections of one another. To remain alone was to exist as only half a person, a mirror with nothing to reflect. The body followed where the soul had already gone. When death finally came, it was swift. She slipped into stillness in the early hours of a cold morning, her breath shallow, her eyes turned toward the empty space beside her bed. Her parents wept, though their grief was clouded by exhaustion and the bitter knowledge that the world had stolen their daughters long before death arrived. The managers and showmen, for their part, showed little sorrow. They had already moved on to the next attraction, the next wonder to plaster on a poster. The twins were gone, but the appetite for spectacle was endless, and their deaths would serve as fodder for yet more sensational headlines. Indeed, the newspapers did not treat her passing as tragedy, but as inevitability. "The surviving miniature maiden follows her sister," read one column, reducing her final days to a predictable coda in a tale of curiosity. The humanity of the sisters was once again erased, their lives summarized as if they were characters in a stage act, their deaths nothing more than curtain calls. In the silence that followed, there was no applause, only the sound of two small lives extinguished, leaving behind nothing but whispers and the faint memory of two sisters who had never been seen for who they truly were. The press wasted no time in turning the sisters' deaths into spectacle. Newspapers across New York and beyond carried the story, but the tone was one of curiosity rather than compassion. Instead of mourning, the articles offered amusement disguised as news, as though the passing of two young women was nothing more than the closing of a theatre act. One paper described the deaths as a fittingly strange conclusion to a strange life, dismissing the tragedy in favor of melodrama. Another headline, bold and unfeeling, announced, "The Miniature Maidens no more." Their real names were scarcely mentioned, buried in the final lines, if at all, replaced by the stage title that had defined and imprisoned them for years. Reporters lingered on the myths that had grown around the sisters. They speculated about whether one soul had truly been split between two bodies, whether the second twin's death was proof of some supernatural connection. Some even romanticized the suffering, suggesting that their deaths were poetic, that they had chosen to follow one another into the grave rather than be parted. Few cared to note the exploitation, the grueling performances, or the relentless travel that had drained their strength. The true causes of their decline, poverty, neglect, and exhaustion, were ignored because they lacked the sensational quality of rumor. For the public, the story was consumed with the same appetite that had once filled the dime museums. Patrons in taverns discussed the reports between drinks, marveling at the idea of twins so bound that death itself could not separate them. Spiritualists claimed it as evidence of their theories, while skeptics dismissed it as coincidence. What united them all was the refusal to see the sisters as ordinary human beings whose lives had been stolen by a society obsessed with difference. Even in death, the twins were denied dignity. Their obituaries were not tributes, but curiosities, written in tones that mocked as much as they informed. They were not remembered as daughters or sisters, but as oddities, their humanity overshadowed by the myths others had forced upon them. The public had been entertained by their lives, and now it sought to be entertained by their deaths. The true tragedy lay in this final insult, that even when their voices were silenced, the world refused to listen to what their story truly meant. The applause had faded, but the cruelty of spectacle echoed on, printed in black ink and sold for pennies on every street corner. The burial of the sisters was as unceremonious as their lives had been exploited. There was no grand procession, no marked headstone, no lasting tribute to the children who had once drawn crowds from across the country. Instead, their bodies were laid to rest in a pauper's grave, one among dozens dug hastily in the frozen ground on the outskirts of the city. The cemetery was overcrowded, its paths muddy, its stones tilting in disarray. Their parents, weary from grief and poverty, could afford no monument, no inscription, nothing that might preserve the memory of their daughters beyond the moment. What little dignity remained was buried with them beneath a mound of earth that bore no name. Those who had profited most from the sisters were nowhere to be found. The showmen who had paraded them before audiences moved swiftly onto new attractions. Their absence was explained away in posters that promised fresher marvels, giants, contortionists, so-called wild men. The tiny twins were gone, but the machinery of spectacle ground on, indifferent to the human cost. Even the newspapers that had reported their deaths so eagerly offered no follow-up, no reflection, no sense that anything had been lost beyond novelty. The grave itself became a kind of silence. No marker meant no reminder, and no reminder meant that the sisters could be forgotten. For a world so eager to watch them live and die, it seemed astonishing how quickly the memory faded. Within weeks, the names that had been spoken in taverns and theatres were gone from daily conversation. The sisters had been consumed as entertainment, and when the entertainment ended, so did the interest. Yet, in the neighbourhood where they had been born, the absence was felt differently. Neighbours remembered the sight of two small girls playing in the street, hands always joined, speaking in their strange, private tongue. For them, the death was not a spectacle, but a lingering sorrow. Still, even these memories were fragile, subject to the erosion of time. Without a stone to mark their place, the sisters' resting ground blended into the rows of the forgotten, their story buried as deeply as their bodies. What remained was a silence heavy with injustice, a silence that whispered not of peace, but of erasure. The world had turned its gaze elsewhere, leaving only shadows where once there had been two inseparable lives. Death did not end the fascination with the sisters. If anything, it transformed it. In the absence of a grave marker or monument, stories began to sprout in the streets and alleys of New York, whispered first among neighbors and then carried outward like smoke. People said that the twins were not truly gone, that their bond had been too strong to be broken by earth or coffin. Some claimed to hear their voices in the quiet hours before dawn, murmuring in that strange, private language that no one else could ever understand. The words were never clear, but the cadence, soft, rhythmic, unearthly, was said to carry through the night air like a lullaby from nowhere. Others swore that their small shadows lingered in the places they had once been displayed. Stagehands claimed that, after the shows had ended and the lamps had been extinguished, they saw twin figures moving in the wings, hand in hand, watching silently as if waiting for the curtain to rise again. One man insisted he heard the sound of light footsteps on the boards of an empty stage, followed by a child's cough that chilled him to the bone. The theatres where they had once performed took on reputations as haunted places, where late workers refused to linger alone. In the tenement where they had been born, too, the stories persisted. Families who lived there afterward spoke of hearing the patter of feet in the hall at night, though no children were awake. Mothers claimed their infants stirred and cried at invisible whispers, as though voices had brushed their ears. Some said the twins appeared together at the edge of mirrors, reflected for a heartbeat, before vanishing. In every version of the tale, they were never alone. One was always with the other, the bond that had defined their lives continuing beyond the grave. To those who believed, these hauntings were not sinister, but sorrowful. The twins did not seek to frighten, but to remind the world of their existence, to refuse the erasure that burial in an unmarked grave had tried to enforce. They had been denied dignity in life, denied memory in death, and so their presence lingered as a protest against forgetting. The legends gave them back what society had stolen: recognition, even if only in whispers. Whether the stories were born from guilt, imagination, or truth, one thing was certain: no one who heard them could ever see the sisters as merely curiosities again. The legends of the twins' return from beyond soon grew into testimonies, accounts told with such conviction that even skeptics found themselves unsettled. A night watchman at one of the dime museums where the sisters had once performed swore that he saw them walking together across the empty stage long after midnight. He described their dresses as pale as frost, their hands clasped, their heads tilted toward one another as if whispering in secret. When he called out, they vanished, leaving only the echo of soft laughter drifting through the hall. Though ridiculed by his employers, he refused ever again to patrol the stage alone. In the boarding houses where the girls had once stayed during their tours, travelers reported strange disturbances. Bedsheets were said to be tugged by unseen hands, and faint, childlike voices murmured in the dark. One woman insisted she awoke to find two small figures sitting at the foot of her bed, watching her silently before fading into shadow. She moved out the next morning, telling anyone who would listen that the sisters still wandered, searching for comfort they had been denied in life. The testimonies were not confined to theatres and lodgings. In the crowded tenement where the sisters had been born, families told of hearing the sound of light footsteps in the hall at night, always two together, never one alone. Children claimed they heard giggles, and some even said the twins spoke to them, teaching them words in a language no adult could understand. Parents dismissed these tales as childish fancies, yet they whispered prayers all the same, uneasy at the persistence of such stories. Spiritualist circles, which thrived in the Victorian era, seized upon these accounts eagerly. Séances were held where mediums claimed to channel the voices of the sisters, speaking in broken fragments of an unknown tongue. To believers, this was proof of the inseparable bond that had survived death itself. To skeptics, it was nothing more than fraud or invention. Yet even they admitted that the testimonies carried an unusual weight. Too many people, in too many places, told stories that echoed the same details. Two small figures, always hand in hand, always together. These stories transformed the twins from mere curiosities into something larger than life, or death. No longer confined to the stage, their presence seeped into the city's memory, haunting not only the buildings they had once occupied, but the conscience of a society that had reduced them to spectacle. Whether ghost or legend, the sisters refused to be forgotten. The persistence of the sisters' story was not surprising in an age already saturated with superstition about twins. Across cultures and centuries, the birth of two children at once had been viewed with a mixture of awe and fear. In some traditions, twins were celebrated as signs of divine favor, beings touched by forces beyond ordinary human life. In others, they were feared as omens, proof of curses or unnatural meddling. The Victorian world, perched uneasily between science and superstition, embraced both views at once. It was a society that prided itself on progress, yet still reached for folklore when confronted with what it could not easily explain. For audiences who had seen the tiny twins on stage, these old beliefs found new life. Their identical appearances and secret language seemed to confirm every rumor about twins being linked in ways ordinary siblings were not. Stories spread that they could read each other's thoughts, that they shared pain, that they dreamed the same dreams. Their closeness, rather than being understood as love, was interpreted as evidence of something otherworldly. When one died and the other followed soon after, many took it as final proof that they had shared a single fate from birth, that their souls had been bound in a way no science could untangle. The fascination was not limited to New York. Victorian literature itself often leaned on twin imagery, using it to symbolize duality, mystery, or hidden truths. Ghost stories of the era featured spectral twins appearing at deathbeds, while penny dreadfuls published lurid tales of twins cursed to haunt the living. The legend of the sisters slid easily into this cultural framework, feeding both the appetite for the supernatural and the need for moral lessons. To some, their deaths were a cautionary tale about exploitation. To others, they were proof that nature held secrets beyond human comprehension. What made the sisters' case unique, however, was the way myth and reality became inseparable. Their actual lives, the hardships, the exploitation, the unrelenting cruelty, were overshadowed by folklore that transformed them into symbols rather than remembered them as people. In this sense, they became part of a wider Victorian pattern, human suffering repurposed as myth, tragedy reshaped into entertainment even after death. Their story, woven into the larger tapestry of twin folklore, ensured that they would not be forgotten. But it also guaranteed that they would rarely be remembered as they truly were, two sisters, bound by love, destroyed by a world that chose spectacle over compassion. The exploitation of the sisters was not unique, but rather part of a cruel tradition that stretched across the Victorian world. Dwarfism, misunderstood and sensationalized, had long been turned into spectacle. Centuries earlier, European courts kept men and women of short stature as jesters or curiosities, dressing them in elaborate costumes to amuse the nobility. By the 19th century, this practice had shifted into the booming world of popular entertainment. Circuses, traveling fairs, and dime museums eagerly recruited those whose bodies set them apart, presenting them as living wonders to crowds hungry for novelty. Perhaps the most famous example was General Tom Thumb, whose rise under P.T. Barnum in the mid-1800s set the pattern for how people with dwarfism would be treated in public life. He was displayed as a curiosity from childhood, celebrated on the one hand, but imprisoned by the expectations of a world that saw him only as an act. Others followed, performers with dwarfism given titles like Prince, Countess, or Marvel, their humanity erased beneath stage names designed to emphasize strangeness. Audiences laughed, applauded, and marveled, rarely stopping to consider the toll such lives took on the individuals themselves. For the tiny twins, this world was already waiting by the time they were born. The template had been created: costumes, posters, exaggerated claims, and endless tours that turned children into commodities. Their size and their twin bond made them irresistible to promoters. Where one performer with dwarfism could draw a crowd, two identical sisters were certain to ignite fascination. In that sense, they were not just victims of circumstance, but of an industry that thrived on difference, an industry that saw their existence as an opportunity for profit. What made their story especially tragic was that the Victorian appetite for spectacle consumed them more quickly than most. They were not given time to mature into adults with choices. Their childhood was stolen almost as soon as it began. The stage demanded them, and once placed beneath its lamps, they could not step away. Their bodies, already vulnerable, were pushed to breaking point by relentless travel, poor care, and constant exposure. Where others with dwarfism managed to carve long careers within the cruel confines of the circus, the twins were ground down in only a handful of years. In this way, the sisters' fate highlights not just personal tragedy, but the broader cruelty of an era. They were part of a system that turned human difference into entertainment, a system that profited from suffering while convincing audiences they were witnessing wonders. The sisters' story was far from isolated. They were caught in a current that swept countless others into the same cruel orbit. To understand their fate is to place it alongside those whose lives were similarly consumed by spectacle. There was Charles Stratton, known to the world as General Tom Thumb, who had been plucked from obscurity by P.T. Barnum and paraded before royalty and commoners alike. Though celebrated as a star, Stratton lived his entire life within the confines of a persona created for him, his own identity buried beneath the stagecraft of Barnum's invention. Then there was Joseph Merrick, the so-called Elephant Man of London, whose severe deformities made him a figure of both pity and fascination. He too was exhibited as a living wonder, his suffering repackaged as entertainment. Even when he found sanctuary later in life, his legacy was defined less by who he was than by how he appeared to others. Similar fates befell bearded women, giants, conjoined twins, and countless unnamed individuals whose bodies were treated as curiosities rather than as human vessels carrying human souls. Like these figures, the tiny twins were stripped of dignity the moment they stepped onto a stage. Their bond, their private language, their laughter, everything that made them children, was twisted into evidence of strangeness. They became not sisters, but symbols, not daughters, but commodities. The showmen who profited from them saw no tragedy in their exhaustion, no sorrow in their decline. To them, one act was no different from another. If the twins faltered, there would always be a new wonder waiting in the wings. The Victorian audience shared in this cruelty, though many would never have acknowledged it. They convinced themselves that applause was admiration, that coins dropped into a ticket booth were acts of support rather than exploitation. Yet, beneath the thin veil of entertainment, the truth was evident. They were consuming lives. The sisters' decline was as predictable as it was ignored, their suffering reduced to gossip and myth, their deaths reported with indifference. What makes their story especially haunting is how ordinary it was in that context. The exploitation of difference was not an anomaly, but a system. The sisters' tragedy, though unforgettable to those who seek it out now, was to their contemporaries little more than another performance ended. In this sense, their fate reflects the broader darkness of an age that valued wonder over humanity, curiosity over compassion. The cruelty of the sisters' story cannot be understood without also examining the crowds that filled the halls to see them. The audiences of the Victorian age were not composed of villains, but of ordinary men and women, factory workers, clerks, merchants, even families who brought their children to gape at the unusual. They paid their pennies with eagerness, not stopping to consider what it meant to watch another's suffering dressed up as entertainment. For them, the stage offered an escape from their own hardship. In a world of poverty and uncertainty, difference became a distraction, and the sight of someone else's struggle reassured them of their own normalcy. Psychologists of later generations would describe this phenomenon as the comfort of otherness, the relief of knowing that whatever misfortunes plagued one's own life, there was always someone more unusual, someone more pitied, someone further from the fragile boundaries of what society deemed normal. To the audiences, the tiny twins were both wonder and warning. They represented the strangeness of nature, the unpredictability of fate, and the illusion that by watching, one could somehow keep such misfortune at bay. But there was more than pity at play. There was fascination, even delight in the spectacle of the different. The twins' matching costumes, their private language, their mirrored gestures, all fed into a voyeuristic thrill. People claimed they wanted to be astonished, but what they truly sought was confirmation of their own superiority. By pointing, laughing, and applauding, they reassured themselves that they were whole, ordinary, safe from the gaze that now fell on the stage. The darker truth was that the audience needed the sisters as much as the showmen did. Without demand, there would have been no supply. Every coin dropped at the ticket booth, every whisper passed in taverns afterward, kept the machinery of exploitation running. The applause that rang through the theatres was not harmless noise. It was the fuel that consumed lives. The audience convinced itself that wonder was innocent, but wonder had a price, and it was paid by the bodies of those on stage. For the sisters, this meant there was no escape. Even if one show ended, another crowd was waiting. Their existence had been transformed into a cycle of fascination and consumption, and the people who might have offered compassion instead became the ones who kept the cruelty alive. If the audiences were complicit in the sisters' suffering, then the scientific world was guilty of abandonment. The Victorian age prided itself on progress, on the discovery of germs, the development of anesthesia, the expansion of hospitals. Yet for all its claims of enlightenment, it turned away from those whose lives most needed understanding. Dwarfism was mentioned occasionally in medical journals, but rarely with sympathy and never with depth. Doctors observed it like a curiosity, listing measurements and classifying body types, but few sought to understand the lived reality of those born with it. To study meant to acknowledge humanity, and in this era, it was easier to look away. The sisters were never treated as children deserving care. When illness struck, physicians muttered about weak constitutions and prescribed tonics that did little more than line apothecaries' pockets. No serious attempt was made to understand why one girl's cough worsened each week, why exhaustion crippled her performances, why her body faltered under the strain of endless travel. To the medical establishment, she was not a patient, but a puzzle with no urgency to solve. And when she died, her passing was not an occasion for study or compassion, but simply another case to be ignored. This silence left space for myth to thrive. Where science refused to give answers, rumor and superstition offered them freely. Audiences clung to the belief that the twins shared one soul, that their secret language was proof of hidden knowledge, that their bond was mystical rather than human. Reporters repeated these tales, spiritualists claimed them as evidence of unseen forces, and the sisters themselves were powerless to correct the narrative. Their voices carried no weight against the authority of public imagination. What makes this neglect so haunting is the possibility of what might have been. Had medicine taken interest, perhaps their illnesses could have been treated more carefully. Had science studied their condition with respect rather than detachment, perhaps their lives could have been longer, their story less tragic. Instead, they were left to the mercies of rumor and the demands of spectacle, their humanity erased not only by the stage, but by the very institutions that claimed to seek truth. The Victorian world congratulated itself on progress, yet when confronted with two fragile sisters who needed care, it looked away. And in that silence, the myths grew louder than the truth. The most painful irony of the sisters' story is how society responded not by remembering them as people, but by reshaping them into legends that served its own needs. The layoff had been planted early. Audiences whispered about curses, about shared souls, about supernatural bonds, and when the sisters died, those whispers became the payoff. Instead of grief, The world embraced myth. Instead of compassion, it chose fascination. Their real lives, full of hardship and small joys, vanished beneath the weight of stories others told in their place. The newspapers celebrated this transformation. They did not print their names, but repeated their stage titles, ensuring that the Miniature Maidens lived on as an act rather than as daughters who had been lost. Spiritualists claimed their bond as proof of unseen forces, pointing to the second sister's decline as evidence of cosmic unity. Crowds who had once laughed at them now spoke reverently of the strangeness of their fate, as though their suffering had been designed for moral instruction rather than inflicted by cruelty. The sisters had been denied dignity in life, and now in death they were denied truth. Even the legends that grew around their supposed hauntings became part of this cycle. The whispers of their shadows moving backstage, the footsteps in tenements, the soft murmur of their secret language in the night, all of it was retold not to honor them, but to thrill listeners. The sisters, who had lived lives bent beneath exploitation, were doomed to serve entertainment even beyond the grave. Their bond, their grief, their silence, all became fodder for stories that blurred the line between sympathy and spectacle. And yet, beneath this distortion lies the tragedy that society refused to face. The twins were not strange creatures bound by curses or omens. They were children, born into poverty, pressed into performance, and broken by neglect. They wanted simple things, the freedom to play, the comfort of ordinary lives, the dignity of being seen as human. That the world denied them these things was not fate or mystery. It was choice. A choice made by audiences who paid to watch, by managers who pocketed profits, and by doctors who turned away. In this way, the sisters' legend is not just a story about them, but a mirror held up to the Victorian world itself. It reveals how quickly society will turn people into myths when truth is too uncomfortable to bear. The story of the sisters cannot be told without facing the truth of what it represents: cruelty masked as amusement. The Victorian world cloaked its hunger for spectacle in words like wonder, marvel, and curiosity, but beneath the polished posters and cheerful applause was something far darker. Each coin tossed into a ticket booth, each clap that echoed through the theatre, was part of a system that consumed human lives for entertainment. And the sisters, fragile and inseparable, were among its most tragic victims. Audiences convinced themselves that their fascination was innocent, even benevolent. They told themselves that to watch was to admire, that to clap was to support. But the applause was not for talent, nor for artistry. It was for difference, for strangeness, for the uneasy thrill of seeing bodies that did not fit the mold of what society called normal. The sisters' private language, their mirrored movements, their small statures, these were treated not as human realities, but as exotic tricks, stagecraft to be consumed and then discarded. Behind every gasp of astonishment lay a refusal to see them as anything other than curiosities. The managers were more overt in their cruelty. For them, the twins were investments, acts to be scheduled, promoted, and squeezed for every penny of profit. Illness was an inconvenience, grief a liability. When one sister collapsed, the show was altered but not ended. When the first died, the tragedy became a marketing point. Even in death, their story was used to sell headlines, to feed gossip, to sustain the machinery of spectacle. Compassion was not part of the business model. The failure of medicine added another layer of cruelty. By refusing to treat them with seriousness, the scientific world allowed myth to take their place. Instead of being studied with care, they were described with cold detachment, or worse, ignored altogether. This neglect reinforced the notion that they were less than fully human, unworthy of the dignity of understanding. And so the sisters were left in the hands of showmen and audiences, trapped in a cycle of fascination that offered them no escape. Their tragedy, then, was not only personal, but societal. It revealed the ease with which an entire culture could disguise cruelty as entertainment, turning suffering into spectacle and convincing itself that no harm was done. The sisters were not simply consumed by an industry. They were betrayed by the world around them, a world that refused to see them as what they truly were, two children who deserved to be loved, not displayed. More than a century has passed since the sisters' brief lives, yet their story continues to echo in ways that are difficult to silence. Part of this persistence lies in the sheer injustice of their fate. Children turned into curiosities, grief turned into gossip, death turned into myth. But another part lies in the unbreakable bond that defined them. Audiences may have consumed their likenesses for novelty, but even the cruelest onlooker could not deny the depth of their devotion to one another. Hand in hand on the stage, whispering in a language only they understood, they embodied a love so pure that even exploitation could not erase it. That bond has become the heart of their legend, a truth that lingers beneath all the distortion. It is perhaps why stories of their haunting remain so vivid. The idea that the twins walk together still, shadows in theatres and footsteps in tenements, is more than a ghost tale. It is an acknowledgement of something that death itself could not sever. The world may have refused to understand them, but their bond was undeniable, and it is this bond that survives in memory long after their names have been lost. Their presence haunts not because they seek revenge, but because they refuse to be forgotten. Their story resonates too because it mirrors questions that remain with us. How do we treat those who are different? Do we celebrate them for who they are, or do we consume their image for our own comfort and curiosity? The Victorian world disguised cruelty as entertainment, but can we truly claim to be free of such practices today? The mediums have changed, screens instead of stages, headlines instead of posters, but the appetite for spectacle has not vanished. The sisters' story reminds us that behind every moment of fascination may lie a life weighed down by exploitation. That is why their memory feels timeless. They were not just products of the 19th century, they are warnings to every age that follows. Their laughter still unsettles because it carries the echo of truth. Their bond still haunts because it reveals the cost of a world that values wonder more than compassion. And their story lingers because in the end, two small sisters who wanted nothing more than to be seen as human were denied even that simplest dignity. The tragedy of the tiny twins is more than a tale of two sisters lost to time. It is a mirror reflecting the failures of an entire age. Their story reveals how quickly society will turn human lives into entertainment, how easily compassion can be drowned out by curiosity, and how cruelty can be justified when it is cloaked in wonder. They were born into poverty, forced onto a stage, consumed by audiences, and buried in silence. Each step of their journey was shaped not by choice, but by the demands of others. And yet, in the midst of all this exploitation, their devotion to one another remained untouched, a fragile light that endured until the very end. What lingers most painfully is the knowledge that none of it was inevitable. The Victorian world prided itself on progress, on science, morality, and refinement, yet it failed to offer the sisters even the most basic compassion. Medicine could have studied their condition with care, but it turned away. Audiences could have chosen to see them as children, but they chose spectacle instead. Families and neighbors could have sheltered them, but whispers and rumors eroded that safety. Each act of neglect, each coin dropped in a ticket booth, built the cage in which the sisters lived and died. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. We tell ourselves that such cruelty belongs to the past, but the hunger for spectacle has never disappeared. It simply wears new clothes. The faces of those who are different, vulnerable, or misunderstood still appear in headlines and on screens, their lives dissected and consumed by strangers. We may not sit in dime museums anymore, but we scroll, we watch, we share. The same appetite lingers, the same moral questions remain. In remembering the sisters, we are challenged to see them not as curiosities, not as legends, but as human beings who were denied dignity. Their haunting presence, whether real or imagined, is a reminder that compassion withheld is cruelty inflicted. Their silence calls to us across the years, urging us to break the cycle of exploitation, to choose understanding over wonder, empathy over entertainment. The Victorian world refused to understand them. We cannot afford to make the same mistake. And yet, even as we try to close the book on their story, there is the lingering sense that it has never truly ended. For more than a century, whispers of the sisters have persisted. Footsteps in the darkened corridors of old theatres, soft laughter in the silence of abandoned boarding houses, the fleeting glimpse of two small figures moving together where no one should be. Whether these are hauntings or simply echoes of memory hardly matters. What matters is that they refuse to be forgotten. They lived together, they died together, and in legend they walk together still. Perhaps that is the real curse, or the real gift of their story. Society may have stripped them of names, dignity, and compassion, but it could not erase the bond that defined them. Their shadows endure not because of the myths invented around them, but because love that's strong leaves a mark. It is a truth as haunting as it is beautiful. The world may look away, but the bond between two sisters remains, whispering across time. So when you hear the creak of floorboards in an empty room, or catch the sound of laughter where none should be, ask yourself, are you hearing the echoes of your own imagination, or the voices of two forgotten children still speaking to each other in their secret language? This is the tragedy of the tiny twins of New York, exploited in life, erased in death, remembered only in myth. But perhaps, in telling their story now, we restore something the Victorian world denied them, the dignity of being seen, not as curiosities, but as human. If you found this story haunting, make sure you are subscribed to the Macabre Record, where we uncover the dark histories and forgotten legends that still echo today. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing how far these voices of the past can travel. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly buried. It waits just beyond the curtain.